have you all here. We've got a bit of a full house. So if you're still looking for a seat, we still have a couple up here on the front. Since we have a lot of, everyone's like, oh, sign me up there. I noticed that people were willing to set up more rows in the middle of a church service rather than sit up front. I feel like this is a check your heart kind of moment. You might have walked past these picnic tables out here that are so nicely laid out there. We have our church picnic today. I need my detail people to make sure I'm not speaking incorrectly. That is not following the service directly, but it's at noon. 11:30. There we go. See? This is why they don't let me be the calendar keeper, because it always goes like this. 11:30. So if you are, even if you're new here today, we'd love to have you be our guest. It's a great time to hang out. There's a number of surprises planned during the church picnic, I'm told. So, we've been going through the book of 1 Corinthians. We're in chapter 9, so you can go ahead and turn there today. Think about for a moment, what does it take to make an Olympian, just like a world-class athlete? What does it take? Probably the household name that comes to mind when we think of world-class athlete on the Olympic stage would be Michael Phelps. And this is not without good justification. He won a total of 82 medals on the global stage in international competitions of all kinds. 23 of these were Olympic medals. He set 39 world records in various events in the pool. And so you go, man, what does it take to be a Michael Phelps? He trained for 5 to 6 hours, 6 to 7 days a week. He swam 80,000 meters a week. That's 50 miles a week for those who are counting. I'm going to start measuring everything I do in meters because it makes it sound so much better. 80,000 meters. He would eat, this is actually the part I'm most impressed with. He would eat 8 to 10,000 calories a day to maintain this level of activity. 8 to 10,000 calories a day. Okay, for reference, a standard pizza is 2,500 calories. So just think about consuming that volume of food in a day. Forget the calorie count. The volume of food required to eat that many calories a day. What does it look like, you ask? For breakfast, he would have 3 fried egg sandwiches followed by 3 chocolate chip pancakes, a 5-egg omelet, 3 sugar-coated slices of French toast, a bowl of grits, and 2 cups of coffee. I've been eating like an Olympian my whole life. I might have this down. For lunch, a pound of pasta, 2 large ham and cheese sandwiches on white bread smothered with mayonnaise and some energy drinks. For dinner, another pound of pasta with sauce and a large pizza and energy drinks. That's a lot of just volume. Basically, he said that he would eat, sleep, and swim, and that's all that he would do when he was in training season. He'd sleep for 8 hours a night and take a 2 to 3 hour nap a day. So you think 8 hours a night, 2 to 3 hours, 6 hours in the pool, and that much eating time, that really is all you do. That's what it takes. Now, you'll hear athletes and Olympians talk about, well, you know, his physical stature, his wingspan being disproportionate, double jointedness, all this other stuff, and sports doctors have basically discredited most of that and said, look, he just perfected a swimming stroke, and he dedicated his life 100% to that. This year, our annual theme has been planting the desert, thinking about using the desert as a metaphor for we live in a spiritually dry place. And for people who live in actually dry places, if you don't regreen the desert just slowly moves in and takes over. And so most of the countries in desert areas have been planting it back so that they can push the desert sands back. And so we ask the question, what does it take to be an Olympian? But what does it take to plant the desert? What does it take to reach our neighborhood? In last week's sermon, I noted that there's about 8 billion people in the world, and 40% of these have never heard the gospel, and most of that 40% don't even have a way to hear the gospel. What does it take to reach them with the gospel? Today, we're going to look at 7 things from Paul that I think he is saying, this is what it takes. In the early part of this chapter, Paul's been talking about what happens when Christians didn't yield their rights to fellow believers. And this was over the topic of idol meat, meat that was sacrificed to idols in a pagan temple. And the outcome of Christians not sacrificing their rights there was that weaker Christians who had come out of temple worship, pagan temple worship, were tempted to go back in. Their lives were destroyed. They were consumed again by by idolatry. Now Paul is taking a similar line of thinking of not yielding our rights for the sake of those in this room, but the question of how do we yield our rights for those not in this room? I want to read, we'll just read the rest of this chapter. It's short. It starts in verse 19. It says, "For though I am free from all, I've made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jew I became as a Jew, in order to win the Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not myself being under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessing. Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not beat as a box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I should myself become disqualified." So Paul opens this section. He says, look, I am free. That's what he's built the whole chapter on of. I really am free. I really do have these rights, these freedoms, these privileges. For though I'm free from all, and now he says, I've made myself servant to all. This is a word in English. It gets translated a number of ways. One way is servant. Another way is slave or bondservant. He says, I am free, but instead of claiming that freedom, I have made myself the slave of everyone, the servant of everyone. And he gives us the reason why. He says, that I might win more of them. Now, some people will take this passage and say, well, Paul said he became a Jew to this group. He became this, that. And he doesn't say that. He says, I became as one of these. And so the first thing, if you've got your notes there, it's the first thing Paul is advocating for. He says, we have to yield our right to freedom. Verse 20, to the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win the Jews. Now this is an ethnic and religious category that Paul is talking about. Now, it's weird for Paul to say, I became as a Jew to reach the Jews. Why is that weird? Because Paul's a Jew. So what is he getting at? Well, I think sometimes it's hard to reach the group that's closest to us. Sometimes it's easy to go, hey, we're going to forget our family, we're going to forget our coworkers, our neighborhood, we're going to take a trip around the world, and we're going to share the gospel with people over there. Now, I'm not putting missions down. I think it's great that we do that. What I'm saying is we have to reach people here. And Paul started with the people who were essentially his own tribe, if you will. This became kind of a practical matter. One of his young disciples that he was training up was named Timothy. Timothy had a mother who was Jewish and a father who was Greek, so Timothy was mixed. And there became this whole question as they moved into a Jewish area, his dad being Greek became a kind of social problem for them. And so Paul required Timothy to be circumcised. Now, here in Corinthians, he says, I became as a Jew, but that had to be the conversation with Timothy. If Timothy, you also are going to become as a Jew to reach the Jews. I would have loved to have been there for that conversation. But there's a sense in which Paul is saying we are adapting the culture that we are trying to reach insofar as we're not breaking the law of God. And starting with our own culture. I know when you get saved out of something, you might feel like you've been freed and even rescued from that thing, and you think, I never want to be around those people, those places, those kinds of things again. And what winds up happening is that we have people who become a believer, and God does this amazing transforming work in their life in a particular place. And we pull them out and we put them in the church, and we say, hey, let's give you a list of rules that will keep you safe from all of that stuff before. And what happens is the people who are in that person's circle never get to see the transformation that happens in this person's marriage or in this person's parenting or in their daily life. They never get to see the blessing that the gospel and the impact the gospel has. All they know is, hey, he got religion and then he was too good for us. And Paul is saying, look, I'm starting with my home people. To the Jew, I became as a Jew that I might reach them. Paul himself, later in the book of Acts, Acts 18, verse 18, it's just a tiny little reference where he says he came out of the temple with his head shaved, for he had taken a vow. When you go back into the Old Testament, there's something called a Nazirite vow. Actually, Samson had taken a Nazirite vow. That's what the whole issue with his hair was about. And so Paul was very willing to take on living like a Jew in order to be able to speak to the Jews. The people closest to us, though, these are the hardest to reach. They know all our dirty little secrets. They know our blind spots. They know our weaknesses. They know everything about us. So to go back and say, hey, you need this message that I've learned. You need to know this person that I've met. That can be difficult. It can be daunting. And yet, this is the first group that Paul names when he's yielding his rights. His rights essentially to be his own person, to go, hey, I'm gladly setting that behind, and I'm moving out, and I'm becoming my own person. The second thing he yields is his rights to identity. Verse 20 says, to those under the law, I became as one under the law, though not myself being under the law, that I might win those under the law. And so, okay, category one is the Jews who are under the law, and now he says, I'm reaching those under the law. He's obviously meaning something different. If not the Jews, then who? Well, there's this group of Greek people who had believed in God, who rejected idolatry, had rejected pagan temple worship, and essentially had kind of sidled up to the Jewish community theologically. They weren't becoming Jews, and they didn't ever officially join the Jewish community, but they became kind of theologically, they agreed with the points of Judaism. And this is the next step for Paul. So you think, well, it's not his own countrymen, so they're different ethnically, they're different linguistically, they're different culturally, but theologically very near to Paul and where he would have been raised. And so step one is, I'm going to be like my own people. All right, no prize there, Paul. All right, now I'm going to be like these other people. They're still God-fearers like me, but they're not quite the same. Honestly, sometimes people who are similar to you but not exactly like you can be the hardest people in the world to get along with. I've been to a lot of places in the world, and people love to ask me, Brian, where was the place that you had the worst culture shock? And they start guessing these places. They hear stories from the jungle and the Middle East and Asia and around the world. And I said, the worst culture shock I ever went through was North Carolina. It's where I went to college. In my thought, I thought, well, Texas, I'm from Texas, we're the South, and North Carolina is the South. What I didn't realize is there are shades of Southern, and mine wasn't quite intense enough. And then I learned that bothered them, and that just became a fun joke between us. But it was like, in my mind, I thought, well, we're kind of culturally the same. We're all, like, I knew if I had gone to California or New York, or I mean, goodness sake, Washington, like how different everybody would be. And yet, North Carolina, I thought, well, they're going to be kind of like me, right? Like they're Southern, I'm Southern, we're going to get along, it's going to be great. And I go over there, and man, those people were weird. Everything was wrong. Like they brought me this barbecue, and on the grill, it smelled amazing. I'm not the kind of person that sends stuff back. I think your food probably gets tampered with when you do that, so my typical motto is just suffer through whatever comes out, because that's better. And I remember my first time getting barbecue, I sit down in the restaurant, and I just smell it on the grill. The waiter comes out, I'm like, whatever that is, I want some of that. And so he brings me out this sandwich that was filled with vinegar, and I was like, what is this? He's like, well, this is that. I'm like, no. This is not that. This is very different. Like, what happened to it between there? Oh, we put vinegar, and we did this. Like, you put vinegar on barbecue? What weirdos, right? What made it difficult was that there's this expectation that they should be like me, and then they weren't. And so I think for Paul, that's kind of how this group is going to be. They ought to be like me. They sound like me. When we talk about God, we're talking about there's one God. He's the creator of the world. He did all these amazing acts. But then when we sit down to eat, like my lunch looks different than their lunch. Who sits first? Who eats first? How the home is organized. All these things look dramatically different. And Paul is saying, I became like those people in order to reach those people. Now he gives, in my ESV, it has it in parentheses, it says, though not myself being under the law. So Paul isn't willing to accept the premise that we can work for our salvation, that we can maintain our own holiness by keeping the law. Paul's written books and books and books about how you cannot do this. So he's not saying, I'm taking again the yoke of the law. He's saying, look, there's this cultural sense in which I'm living like them in order to be able to reach them. He was careful to note that he was under the law of Christ. I cited a story with him and Timothy where he required Timothy to become circumcised. There's an opposite story, though, that happens in the book of Galatians where he's traveling with another one of these young guys who's named Titus. And all of the Jews around him that are wanting people, okay, you became Christian, now you kind of need to get the full blessing of being Jewish. And in front of them, he said, I am preventing Titus from accepting circumcision because we are not going to accept your yoke of the law. So these issues of what is right and wrong and how do we navigate through these become immensely more complex. The third group is we yield our rights to cultural safety. Verse 21, those outside the law, I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but being under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. So group one is the Jewish people that are around him. Group two is the God-fearers who theologically are kind of like the Jews, but ethnically and culturally very different. Group three, we have left Kansas. We are no longer there. He's talking about Gentiles who think like Gentiles, who eat like Gentiles, who believe like Gentiles. These are the people who are outside of the law. They would have had a Greek or a Roman worldview. There's a progression here as he's moved from his place of homeness, right, where he is comfortable, to the next level, and now he is out in the world. This is actually parallel to the story of the book of Acts. Acts 1:8 starts with, you'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth, right? So we think geographically, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, the ends of the earth. And this is where the book of Acts unfolds as they left Jerusalem under persecution and they spread further and further and further away. And Paul is saying this kind of on a personal level. I'm starting with the Jews. I'm going to be like them, then the God-fearers, and now the Greeks. He's really uncomfortable now. He didn't hold to the exact prescription of the law. He couldn't hold to the exact prescription of the law as a Jew. We already saw this in reference to how he saw meat, how he saw the temple, where he would say the temple is now the believers. It's no longer that building that's over there in Jerusalem. For a Jew, that would have been heretical to think about. Sometimes sticking with your own group makes life simple. All right? You wake up Jewish. What do you do with idol meat? Idols are bad. Idol meat's bad. Can we eat it? No. What do we do with people who invite us over to their house to eat idol meat? We don't go. In fact, we don't even talk to those people, lest we be tempted to eat idol meat. Haven't you read our history where our forebears did idolatry and then God punished them? Let's not do that. Simple. But the law of Christ is different. The law of Christ, his people are now intermixed with the nations. And just simply saying, well, our people have always done it this way. We're this tight little tribe, and we have to do it one way, without ever understanding that God chose Israel to be a light to the nations. This has to expand our thinking. The morality of every single thing we do has to now be weighed in light of our own freedom. Paul's saying, I'm free to do these things. The Corinthian believers were saying, hey, we're free to do things. We're free to live how we want. We have to take what we now know to be our theological freedom and say, okay, am I willing to yield this for the sake of the believers around me? But one step further, am I willing to do it for the sake of my neighbor, who maybe ethnically is like me, maybe ethnically is not like me, maybe religiously is completely unlike me? I was so excited at VBS this week to see how many different nationalities and languages were being spoken right here. We had kids that were speaking in Russian. We had kids that spoke Arabic, kids that spoke Spanish, kids that spoke Mandarin. We just had so many languages in one place. God is changing our neighborhood. And if our comfort level doesn't change with that, we only have a couple of options. We can become insular, where we keep kind of that Jewish mentality of, well, let's enforce these strict cultural boundaries so that if you're not like us, you kind of know you're not welcome here. Or we could take the idea of flight. Let's go somewhere where it's safe. The other option is to say, okay, God, part of the gospel is that it can be put into local human clothes, local human language, local human culture. Paul is teaching us how to live out the verse from Galatians 3:28, where he says, there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. We are all one in Christ. The next thing Paul yields, he yields his right to power. Verse 22, he says, to the weak I became as weak, that I might win the weak. So the question is, who are the weak? He's just spent a chapter talking about the weaker brother, the weak Christians, the new believers who are being saved out of idolatry in the temple. And so you would say, well, the weak obviously are those people. And yet, Paul is talking about winning them to Christ. And so it can't be those people. I think Paul is talking in a culture, in a place where there's a lot of affluence, where people have shown up to Corinth because they can work for themselves and they can make it. And with this comes status, it comes prestige, comes wealth. And Paul is saying, I am willing to give up my status, my prestige, my plans, my wealth for the sake of reaching those who don't have those things. Greco-Roman culture was built on status. If you had status and power, you flexed this to your advantage. If you didn't have status or power, you tried to form an alliance with people who had status and power. You give them loyalty and support and service, and in return, they give you protection. Paul, we see throughout the story of Acts, Paul allowed himself to be in poverty. Paul allowed himself even to be beaten as a Roman citizen. He had the right, literally a legal right, not to be beaten without a trial, and he allowed it to happen. It seems that the weak here Paul is talking about the ones who are underprivileged and powerless. A lot of times when we try to help people, we do it in a way that makes sense to our cultural narrative. And so the cultural narrative of helping is, I have something, you don't, let me help you. And that sounds good on the surface, and it is good on the surface. I'm not saying don't help people because you have and they don't. But there can be an added sort of worldview element of by having something, I am here to help, and this is something that makes me feel good, and it makes me look good, and it affirms who I am. Why do most mission trips go to places of poverty throughout the world? Because we are rich Americans, and we can go down, and we can help people, and we can feel a little sense of affirmation of, wow, wasn't it really great to help those who have less than us, who are in poverty, who are this. And I'm not saying it is wrong to help the poor. Jesus says a lot about the poor. It's scary to talk to people who are smarter than me, have more money than me, have more status than me, have no reason in the world to ever want to engage with me. When people talk about reaching internationals, a lot of times we talk about reaching refugees. And refugee ministry is hard work. It's a lot of cross-language work. It's a lot of physical labor, helping people set up apartments and finding stuff for them and helping them come from a war-torn area to here where they have a home and to get their feet under them. It's a lot of work. But it's even harder to talk to somebody from, name the place, Obscuristan somewhere, and they have a PhD and a job better than ours and a car better than ours. We saw this all the time in Houston, where people would gravitate towards the poor neighborhood. Well, not that there's anything wrong with that, but we had even more people from the same countries, from the same religious backgrounds, who just had doctor in front of their name and lived in houses that I'd say the prices, because in Houston those were impressive prices, but here it would just make you sick and you'd all move there. But really expensive houses, really nice parts of town, really great cars. Don't look it up online. Right? And it's a scary thing. How do I engage with that person? If I say, hey, you're hungry, let me feed you, obviously there's a quick open door there. But if I go, man, you have nothing, how do I talk to you? How do I take that first step? That's intimidating. I think that's what we deal with in our community here. We're in an affluent place where it's not really apparent why our neighbors should need anything from us or why the community might need anything from us. Sure, we have poor people here. We have need here. But by and large, we're around people that are at least our equals, if not a higher status than us. But Paul is saying, look, I'm willing to change my status level. I'm willing to take the prestige that I have as an apostle. Paul's an international traveler here. That's a super rare thing, unless you're some kind of dignitary. He said, I'm willing to do this, and I'm willing to take on, I'm going to take a beating for the sake of the gospel. It's a hard challenge. He identified with their status. He shared in their weakness and their pain in order to share with him. But then he gets into the why. Why should we yield our rights? In the second half of this verse, he says, I've been all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it for the sake of the gospel, that I might share with them in its blessing. This has been a phrase that he's repeated 6 times. Verse 19, he says, that I might win more. Verse 20, that I might win the Jews. The second half of 20, that I might win those under the law. Verse 21, that I might win those outside of the law. Verse 22, that I might win the weak. And now, that I might save some. All of these things he is doing, his purposeful life, his MO, his way of being, always has the other person in mind, whether it's a fellow Christian or somebody out there in the world. Now, the challenge, and we're going to see this as he gets into next week, the challenge is he's with both of those groups. He's with a group of Christians who count as the weaker brother, who can't eat meat sacrificed to idols and can't be around people who do. And then he also has people inviting him over for dinner who are like, hey, we got this from the temple. Let's sit down and eat. And he has to balance this, and he's going to spend the next at least chapter and some change trying to help balance these two worlds. But he goes on in verse 24, and he starts using the analogy of a race and a runner running the race. Paul would have seen the Isthmus Games. They would have happened there in Corinth. They happened every other year, and these games were second only to the games that happened in Athens every year. This was a huge event. And in the ancient world, runners would run and they would compete, and at the end of the race, they would get a crown, a laurel that was woven evergreen, and it's placed on their head. It's a perishing crown of glory. Imagine how quickly that died. Imagine the work that it takes to get to that level, to win the prize, and then a week later, it's like, well, the event's over. The record is forgotten or smashed by somebody younger than you. So Paul's going to give us some advice. So the first things were things he had to let go. Now these are 3 things that we're going to take on. The first thing is we have to embrace self-control. Verse 25, he says, every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. There's a level of discipline that the athletes who actually make it to the top tier, that they show. The waking up, the putting the time in the gym, the putting the reps in, the eating, the things they don't eat, the life dedicated to that. And they do all of this for something that's going to pass away. In our world, at least, it's like a gold medal. At least your victory's recorded in a database somewhere. You're kind of known for a little bit of time. Here, it's just, you get something made out of evergreen that dies pretty quickly. But think of the dedication that even some of us might do. If you're training for, a marathon or an Ironman or something, think of the dedication that it takes. That's why a lot of us don't do it, because who's got time for that? And so here, they're doing this dedication for something that passes away, but Christ is calling us to work for something of eternal glory. Do we show the same level of discipline? Do we show the same level of dedication that someone simply trying to hit a PR is showing? Someone who's simply trying to place in an okay spot in a 5K sometimes shows more dedication and more self-control than we do, knowing that we work for the King of glory and he has called us to his eternal purpose. They are doing this discipline for something that's passing away, that's something that's dying quickly, but God is calling us to have the same level of self-control, the same level, but for something that's eternal, that's not going to pass away. All run the race, but only one receives the prize. So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. Verse 26, he says, so I do not run aimlessly. Paul wants us to embrace purposefulness. I don't run aimlessly. I don't run without purpose. Started biking a couple years ago, and I got a book on how to cycle better. And this guy trains real athletes. And you read books like that, you're like, oh man, I could do this. And he starts talking about keeping a keeping a training journal. Like a training journal. Nobody's got time for a training journal. Every single time you get on the bike should have some purpose, right? Something that you're trying to work towards. And before long, I'm like, wow, this does not sound like fun at all. I got on the bike to have fun, and this sounds like just work. And it is. It's self-control. It's purposefulness. I don't run aimlessly. There's a reason why Paul is running. There's the runs that are getting up to this race that he's calling us to. There's a reason why you do it. He says, I don't box as one beating the air. I'm not just swinging my fist wildly in a boxing match. Think of the purposefulness of eating, rest, exercise, cross-training, all of these things. And Paul's saying, look, you don't just enter into this without a plan, which is why the next plan is embrace enslavement. Verse 27, but I discipline my body, I keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. He uses this word discipline. This word has three primary meanings. The first one is it means to blacken an eye. The second one is it means to bring someone or something into submission by constant annoyance. And number three, it means to put under strict discipline or to punish. Jesus told a story in the Gospels about a widow who came to an unjust judge, and she came to him day after day after day. He used this word. It says, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will give her justice so that she will not beat me down by her continual nagging, so you won't beat me down. It's the same word. So Paul's saying, I don't box against the air. I don't beat the air. What is Paul boxing? What's he beating up? Himself. He's saying, I beat myself. I think there's one translation that actually translates it that way. I discipline my body and keep it under control. Now, earlier he said all athletes exercise self-control. Self-control there, in Greek, these are two completely different words. Self-control there is what we think of as self-control. Sober-mindedness, the ability to kind of maintain your emotions or maintain control of yourself. And so you'd think, well, here he's using the same word just a second way. But the reality is it's not this word at all. This is actually the same word that he opens the passage with, where he says, I made myself a servant of all. Which, as I said then, is the word for slave. I became a slave to everyone that I might win some. And here he's saying, I discipline my body and I enslave it. I keep it locked up, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. What is Paul worried about? What is this disqualification? And why does it matter? Paul is again using this race analogy where you have to compete, and you have to compete according to the rules, or your competition is nothing. All of your discipline, all of the sacrifice, it's nothing. It just goes away. There's another household name, Lance Armstrong. Won the Tour de France 7 times. He beat testicular cancer at the age of 25. I remember I was a kid in Texas. He's from Texas. It was a huge deal for us. I remember hearing pundits debate the kind of advantage that the 40 grams that he lost in his cancer surgery were giving him a races. Now, it sounds funny to us. Like, mind you, certain cycling events are won by like a tire thickness, and so they might have something. But he became a household name. He became a cause. He became a movement. He's the cancer survivor who went on to come back, compete on this global stage to win the Tour de France and all, to win it 7 times in a row. I mean, this was phenomenal right until he was exposed. After years and years of silencing people, threatening people, destroying careers, he finally came clear and confessed that he'd been using performance-enhancing drugs. He did this on the Oprah Winfrey Show. And he says, the definition of cheat is to gain an advantage on a rival or foe that they don't have. I didn't view it that way. I viewed it as a level playing field. And so basically what he's saying is everyone was doing it, and so I was simply maintaining a competitive level. And to be a little bit fair to him, 20 out of the top 21 top 3 finishers in all of the years he competed were all guilty of doping as well. He lost $75 million in a single day. He was stripped of his 7 titles. He was banned from ever competing in any kind of Olympic event ever again. He became the poster child for the greatest scandal in sports history of any sport, the levels to which he went. We're talking blood transfusions in a hotel room. I mean, this was the same amount of dedication that athletes show to performance, he was showing to cheating. And gosh, if he wasn't good at it. But at the end of the day, if we discipline ourselves and we enslave ourselves, we keep ourselves chained up for a purpose, and then we cheat along the way, Paul is saying, I am doing this so that at the end of the day, I'm not Lance Armstrong, where everything I've worked for, all of the glory, all of the status, all of the victories that I've been working for are taken in a moment and erased to nothing. I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. The church is in a long and protracted state of scandal, it seems. Lots of denominations, stuff from 50, 60 years ago is coming to light in mass, and there's a reason why we as Christians need to be self-disciplined. That in preaching to others, we do not become disqualified ourselves. I want to give a couple points of application. Number one, this pattern of being all things to all people, this is following in the footsteps of Jesus. How do we know who God is? How can we know God? God is an infinite being. He is spirit. He is eternal. He made this world, but we don't physically see him in this world. Well, in the person of Jesus, God poured himself into human form. He was a person in the first century who would have spoken the local language, wore the local clothes, lived a normal life according to Jewish standards. He was easy to see and read and understand and get to know. But essentially, God took something that is infinite and put it into a finite body so that we could understand who he is. Why are there 4 gospels in the Bible? 4 different audiences. It tells one story, and yet you can see how the focus changes. The one that's written to the Jews is really trying to show Jesus is the long-awaited Messiah. The one written by the doctor, you see his personality come through of details. He tells you, like, Jesus is standing here, and the wind was blowing that way that day. Here's who was in leadership in the Roman government at that time. The one that's written to soldiers is the shortest book, and is moved along by this word immediately because soldiers had a short attention span. It's one story, but it's put into 4 different ways. Imagine introducing a friend to another friend. You've got one friend that loves movies and one friend that hates movies. Well, their love or hate of movies is not the only thing about them. Maybe they both, like archery or who knows what. You find that thing that connects them. You say, hey, let me introduce you to this person. The 2 people haven't changed. Their interests haven't changed. You've just chosen a side of them to show. There's a pastor from Mozambique who said he said of the Western missionaries, they scratch where we don't itch. When we don't learn how to cross cultures, when we don't learn how to be all things to all people, it's an uncomfortable process. What we wind up doing is I have a list of questions in my head that I feel very concerned about. What is my meaning in life? That's a very Western question. Most of the rest of the world is not struggling with their meaning in life. Their struggle is, how do I keep my kids healthy when we live in a place with no doctor, right? How do I keep the crops growing when we don't have the modern farming equipment and everything else that they do in the West? He says they scratch where we don't itch. Jesus took on human form so we would understand him, and Paul is calling us to do the same thing. We can take on the clothes, if you will, of those around us, but we have to let go of who we are. We have to yield our rights. Number 2, our default position on cultural issues shouldn't be to assume our own comfort. It shouldn't be to assume our own cultural position is the right position. It also shouldn't be haphazard. It shouldn't be aimless, as Paul says. It has to be disciplined, intentional, and controlled. We can't just rely on tradition to guide our moral decisions. Paul couldn't say, well, I'm Jewish, and idol meat is bad, and so everybody just stay away from anybody that touches idol meat. He realizes we're living in a world where everybody around us is eating idol meat. We have to do something with that. On the one hand, it destroys our Christian brothers. On the other hand, if we can never be around people who have idol meat in their home, how will they ever hear the gospel? The answer is they won't. So our default position can't be, well, what makes me comfortable? What am I allergic to and can't eat? It has to be, how do I put myself into their world so that they can see what a Christ-transformed life looks like in their context? We live in a complex world, and we have to go back to what the Bible actually says is and is not sin. We cannot assume our cultural traditions have taught us this correctly. Number 3, we need long-term, disciplined approaches to discipleship, to spiritual formation, and to growth. Let's face it, we're all pretty distracted as humans. Paul wants us to have the mind of an Olympian, but not to just be focused on a temporal race. Not that there's anything wrong with a temporal race. He wants us to have this be focused on Christ and on sharing Christ with others. That's the level of dedication and focus that we should be having. Let me close this in prayer, and then I'm going to invite, we have a team that's headed to Costa Rica soon, and so we're going to pray over them this morning. So if you're on that team, just go ahead and come on up while I'm praying. Lord, we just pray that you would give us wisdom in how to do this. Give us the dedication and the discipline. I know it's so easy to seek the path of least resistance, to seek our own comfort.